welcome to the Memberverse podcast. I'm your host, Dave Pancham, also the CEO of Pancham, your fitness marketing agency. Today, what we do here, we like to interview experts, professionals in the fitness industry, people who are making an impact in the fitness industry. And today, I have a special guest, Mr. Mitch McGinley. Mitch is a business broker for helping to buy and sell boutique fitness gyms, but he actually comes from the fitness industry to begin with. He actually owned a studio of his own, grew it, scaled it, exited it, and then has now fallen into this space where he's helping others to do the similar thing or looking to purchase. So, Mitch, I'd love to first get a little bit about your story. Would you mind sharing, first, how did you get in the fitness industry and lead us to how you got to where you are now?
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me, Dave. It's great to be here. Real quick, it's one of those stories that looking backwards makes total sense. But if you had told me 20 years ago what I would be doing right now, I never would have believed you in a million years. My first career was in hotels. My college degree was in psychology. I started working for Omni Hotels when I graduated. And then honestly, my first intro to fitness was my mother-in-law is an entrepreneur. She's the only person in my family who's an entrepreneur. And she's owned a boutique fitness studio in Northern New Jersey for the last 40 years. And so when I married my wife, wow. I know, right? Especially now, I think about that now and it's even more impressive. But my wife was born into that. And so she had that experience as a child growing up in a studio where, that was the community and that was their friends and just a really positive impact on her. And so when we got married, we practiced yoga together. She's a phenomenal teacher, among many other things. We kind of always had this dream of owning a yoga studio. And when I reached the point in my career where I realized that I didn't want to be a manager anymore, that I wanted to be an owner, I left Omni Hotels I went back to school, I got an MBA. I went to work with a guy who was buying boutique hotels, fixing them up, and then selling them. And that was my first introduction to business transactions. And so as I was learning about that, the opportunity to buy our favorite yoga studio was presented to us. The owner just called us, said, "Hey, I'd love to sell and I'd love to sell to you." It was perfect timing. We wanted to start a family. And so we said yes. And I quit my job with equity in hotels to buy a yoga studio that was pretty much breaking even. And that was about 10 or 11 years ago. And so ever since then, it's been a crazy story that involves, being an owner, manager, consultant. I started working with MindBody back in 2016 in their education department, doing MindBody University and speaking at MindBody Bold, just helping people be better business owners in this space. And then, ultimately when we sold our studio in 2019, I got a lot of people asking me for help with buying and selling studios. And so I just created this brand of boutique fitness broker and made this all that I do. And so for the last 5 years, this is all I've done.
Wow. And so, if you don't mind sharing a bit about the story of so you acquired the studio. I'm assuming you scaled it to a certain level. What were the biggest challenges that you dealt with over that time period of being the owner of making that transition into the owner of that business and helping to get it to where, you were able to actually exit it?
There were three things that I point to consistently that we did. Number one, and I think it's really important for anyone who's ever looking to scale a business when they look at it to see where they know that they're going to add value. And so since we were in this community, I saw the shortcomings that were happening at the front desk in terms of customer service. And there were some issues with the physical space. And there wasn't a lot of structure. It was like classes would be canceled and nobody would know. Things like that I felt like were easy to fix. So the three things that we stepped in and did right away. The first was customer service. We stopped having teachers do check-ins for classes, and I sat at the front desk and did every check-in. So I knew every client. I recognized them by name, welcomed them, smiled at them, gave them a hug. That part of it was really important, I think, for creating that community feel and making people feel really welcome when they walked in. The second thing we did was we made an adjustment to the physical space. So I live in a funky little beach town in San Diego. The space itself was one of those where you could open the door and walk straight into the practice space. And that led for some really uncomfortable situations in the middle of class. And so we put up a wall that created a lobby and had a couch, and it encouraged people to stay after class or come before class and hang out and talk to each other without interrupting class as it was going on. And so that was a really helpful logistical thing that we did. And then the third thing that we did, and I know you talk about this a lot, was we started to create systems for marketing and sales and making sure that everybody was really, really clear on their roles and responsibilities, and that we were putting people in a position to thrive. So, a simple example, again, is not asking teachers to do check-ins. Having someone at the front desk who knows how to do sales in an authentic way was really, really important. And so those were the three things that we did. And over the course of the first 3 years, we pretty much doubled the gross revenue. And since the expenses were largely covered at that point, most of those dollars were falling straight to the bottom line. And so we were really able to grow the profitability of it. And since that's what valuations are based on, that's why we were able to sell it for, almost 5 times what we bought it for.
Do you feel like were there any, have you ever bought a business before that?
No, that was a first for me.
Family, right?
Yeah, I mean,
so did you see those opportunities up front, or how did you go through the evaluation of figuring out I love this studio? How did you realize that you could see all that value, all the opportunity how did you figure out that this was a great opportunity for you here?
I think it had to come from my experience with buying the hotels that I had just gone through. I was part of that group that bought 2 separate hotels. We were able to identify places where we could easily add value. I'll give you a simple example. It's hotel related, but one of the hotels, you couldn't make a reservation online. I can't think of anything that's more basic or straightforward that a hotel needs than, and so we stepped in and did that, and the revenue tripled. And so, I say that jokingly too, because there are a lot of boutique fitness businesses out there who started because someone loves teaching or being a trainer, and they're really good at it, but they don't love business, and they don't get into the fun nuance of creating systems and sales and marketing to, retain people. And I had seen some of that with the hotels and seen the success that we had. And fortunately, since we'd been practicing yoga for long enough, had practiced at many different studios, saw a lot of pros and cons of different offerings, and felt like there was some really simple things we could add.
Have you, I think this almost, you've come from an experience of buying certain businesses, and you've been in this space for a bit. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen people make, or at least the incorrect judgments that they've possibly made about potentially acquiring a business? Because I'm sure, you've seen it out there. People have acquired a business and it has not gone the way that they thought it would go.
Oh man, I'm not sure if we have enough time. There's so many mistakes that I've seen. I'm mildly traumatized by a lot of this stuff. But a couple of the main ones that I always want people to really walk away and take home with. On the seller side, it's absolutely critical that you show your profit on your tax returns. That becomes the most important thing for a lender. If somebody is buying your business from you, both the buyer and the business have to qualify. And I don't think most owners know that. And people in this industry have a habit of writing off everything they possibly can to minimize their tax liability, which is normal and part of playing the game and why we all do this. But when you're going to sell, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. It's very similar if you're self-employed and try to get a mortgage. It's a lot harder because they really dig through your finances a lot harder. They want to make sure that you're making that money. And so a lot of times sellers will look at something like this and be like, oh, well, I'm really making $100,000 a year for myself, but don't mind my tax returns that say 25. Well, the bank's going to look at it and see 25. And so they're only going to lend a multiple of that number, and you're not going to get the value that you need. So that on the seller side, that is the most number one thing. Please, if there's one takeaway, show your profit on your tax returns in the year or two leading up to a sale. On the buyer side, I think the most common mistake that I see with buyers is it's hard to say, but they're too afraid. It takes a special kind of person to believe in themselves enough to be an entrepreneur. And this is an industry where a lot of times our buyers are first time business owners. It may be a manager or a teacher or a client who's buying their favorite business and they're just terrified. And so if you're operating from a place of fear, I don't think that you're going to be successful because you're manifesting a negative outcome. And yeah, I'm a yoga guy. That's a little woo woo, but I think it's really true. It's you have to believe in yourself and believe that you're going to be successful, and not be so scared of the things that you don't know, because everyone gets a doctorate in business by owning their own business, and you just have to go through it to learn it. And once you do, you're going to be good to go.
Does that, what have you found? Is it easier to, I guess on the buyer side, someone looking to buy a business, do you find that it's easier for someone to come in and potentially buy like a fitness franchise versus, an independent boutique fitness studio?
It is. There are a lot more people that have faith that a franchise is going to be easier for them, that they're going to have support, that they're going to have this roadmap of how to do everything. And for that reason, franchises tend to trade a little bit higher in terms of multiples. And so to give you an example right now, Club Pilates is probably the darling of the boutique fitness industry at the moment. A lot of success coming out of COVID, right place, right time, right model, really great offerings. Um, I'm selling those for between 4 to 5x that that EBITDA number for trailing 12 months, which is really exciting to share. I'm excited for everyone to hear that. It's been a long time, I think, since anybody was talking about a 4 to 5x multiple. Um, but independent brands are so much more unique. And so you really need to find someone who shares the same vision, who has the same passion for that very specific thing that you're offering. And, when there's less competition, it's harder to drive the price up. And so it's a lot more common for independent brands to be, more in that 2 to 3x range. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to this. It depends on how big the numbers are, how involved the owner is, how strong is the staff, that kind of stuff. But definitely true that there's more buyers out there for franchise models.
All right, so there's a whole bunch of can of worms that have opened up in my head here. Uh, so my first question that you kind of hit on, you slightly hit on this. What is the state of the industry with buying and selling, gyms right now? I'm sure it was a whole different ball game during COVID-19. Right? Like, what was it like during that time period? What are we looking at now? How's it changed?
Different worlds. And it's crazy because I started doing this right before COVID happened. And so, on one hand, it was awesome that I sold my studio right before COVID happened. But then I started this business trying to sell studios and no one was buying them because they were shut down. And so, people didn't want to buy them. Lenders didn't want to lend to anyone to buy them. Depending on what state you're in or what country you're in, you might be in a very, very different, like Canada, for example, had the hardest time with this. I mean, they were shut down 4 different times, I think, over 2 years, made it really difficult to sell any businesses. Versus now, I think January of 2023 was when we really felt a positive shift in this market. It's just continued to be a positive trend since then. And so, even saying a minute ago that 4 to 5x multiple, like I was not talking about those numbers 2 years ago at all. They may have been happening. I didn't see them, but I feel like the market's in a great place right now. It's certainly the best place that it's been in the last 5 years. And so I'm seeing a lot of really great activity.
When you say it's in a great place, is it lean one way where it's more of like it's a buyer's market right now or it's a seller's market right now?
I try not to characterize it in that particular way. There's good deals and bad deals, and they're all unique to the individuals involved in the situation of the business. It's nothing like housing where we have so many data points that you can really get down and dirty with the numbers and be really accurate with what's market value. So much of it depends on the value that you are going to add as the new owner. And so you might see a business that you think, or other people might think is overpriced, but you, Dave, being an expert in everything that you're an expert in, know that you can step in and add so much value that you're gonna crush it. And so to you, it's a great deal. Might be a bad deal for somebody else that doesn't know how to do what you do. So when I say it's a great market, what I really mean is lenders are willing to lend. There's no issue getting loans to buy these businesses. Um, the general trend of the industry is rising. It's continuing to grow. The industry is growing. Everyone believes it's going to keep growing. Um, a lot of the modalities that we saw kind of struggling more coming out of COVID, like yoga and cycle and bar, have had a lot more of a struggle coming out of COVID, are starting to come back. And I just closed a deal yesterday on a multi-unit bar franchise in Nashville that was the best, highest value bar deal that I've ever done. And so all of that is just really encouraging anecdotal evidence that the whole industry is doing well.
That's good to hear. And you mentioned that you talked about Club Pilates, 4 to 5x multiple. Why? What is it that stands out about them? Like why was that? Why have they been so successful, or why are they commanding higher multiples maybe than another boot camp style studio or anything else out there?
Their margins are kind of silly. Um, I'm consistently seeing margins of 40, sometimes 50% at these locations. And, all credit to the owners and the operators and the company. The model is brilliant. It's exclusive. The club, you got to be in the club. There's only 12 spots. If you want to reserve your spot in class, you got to book it weeks ahead of time. It's that nothing draws a crowd like a crowd. And when, your favorite restaurant's really hard to get into, you're going to make that reservation a month ahead of time to make sure that you can get there. But what ends up happening is, you get 400 people paying for a membership, and a whole bunch of them don't use it, because it's part of belonging to that club and identifying with it, paying a premium for it, just to feel like you're in that club. So huge margins. The other thing that really affects it, honestly, is, when you get into the numbers, they're very attractive. And so when a bunch of different groups with a bunch of money see attractive ROI, they start competing to buy the locations. And that's the best thing that can happen. And that's honestly where we add so much value as brokers, is leveraging multiple offers against each other, so that even when you're working with us and paying a fee, you're walking away with more money than you would have if you weren't working with us.
Makes sense. So I would say most of our audience is going to be, most people are, existing gym owners, not somebody that's looking to buy, a boutique fitness, gym for the first time here. So I think probably what's the most relevant is looking to potentially sell their business, because, everybody gets entrepreneurial ADD after a certain amount of time. They want to move on to something else. What would you say should be the process or the steps for somebody here who's maybe thinking about selling their gym? What should they be thinking about? Conversations? What should they be looking at in their business? How do they get prepared for this?
I love that you specifically said conversations, because I think the best thing, and this is very and this is all true of gyms, spas, I use boutique fitness sort of as a reference point most often, but this all applies to, honestly, every type of retail service business. All these things are true. So, conversations, plant seeds with prospective buyers years in advance. A lot of times owners are scared to death to say out loud that they're looking to sell. And I totally understand that. I was there. I didn't want to tell people I was looking to sell. But knowing everything I know now, the best buyers come from within the community. They love the business. They love the people. They know you. They trust you. They probably see ways that they could add value. And if they're never aware of the opportunity to buy it, they're never going to be able to buy it. And so the best advice I can give is have those conversations in a very authentic, nonchalant way years in advance, to say, hey, I'm going to be looking to sell in the next couple of years. My kids are going away to college, or, whatever the reason is. It always kind of accompanies some bigger life transition. I think you'd be the perfect person to carry it into the next chapter. And so if you're interested, let me know. Always happy to have that conversation. Obviously, no rush, no pressure. This isn't going to happen for several years. Just starting to try to put an exit strategy in place. And then you walk away from it, and there's nothing else you need to say. And what happens in the interim is that person goes home and starts dreaming about it. And it takes a little while for that dream to take shape. And maybe they start hating their corporate job a little bit more. And they get in a big fight with their boss one day, a year and a half down the line, and they've had enough. And they're like, I just want to be my own boss. And they come back to you and they say, hey, I want to revisit this conversation. And in that moment, as an owner, you've got so much more leverage because you're not actively selling it. It's a private conversation. You can really push to get what you want. And if you do that with the people who you genuinely believe would be the best candidates, we all know how gossipy these communities are, right? Like, I'm not going to lie and say it's going to get kept a secret, but that actually helps too, because then when it gets into the second and third levels of clients knowing that you might be looking to sell, it's going to find the right person who's looking to do something like this. And I always share that about 50% of our buyers have come from within the community. So we've done close to 60 deals at this point. Half of them have been a teacher, a client, or a competitor, a trainer, one of those people. And so if you're not including them, you're probably cutting 50% of the best prospective buyers out of the loop.
And so when it comes to, that's what we found too. Like, we've been in this space now for like 5 or 6 years, and we've had clients that have been with us for a long time, and then they've sold it to another owner, and that client's been with us. And a lot of times it's been like the trainer or a person that's been a member of the staff. So the story makes perfect sense now. I didn't think about planting those seeds, years in advance, but now thinking back to some of those stories, that's kind of how some of these organically happened. When it comes to selling, outside of profitability, what are the other things that they should be making sure that they have like in place for that sale, to make it appealing for a buyer, or the opposite? Like, what are the red flags besides low profitability or no profitability that you should be making sure you're working on?
I'm going to put businesses into a couple different buckets here, because depending on what your goal is, if you're an entrepreneur who wants to scale and get to 3 to 5 locations and potentially exit in a way that's very ambitious, I'm talking to you in this moment. The goal is usually to bring in some sort of private equity investment once you get to 5-ish, where that private equity investment then goes to scaling very rapidly. And so, to use a couple of generic numbers, let's say you've got 2 locations and you're making $200,000 a year in profit. Hopefully it's better than that, but just trying to meet everybody where they are. And you want to get to 20 locations. There's private equity companies out there who are interested in scaling great brands with great entrepreneurs, where they can put a bunch of money into it, and then you can go open 15 or 20 more locations over the next few years and really take it to a massively higher value. Those are few and far between, let's be honest. It's hard to do that. But if that's what you're dreaming of, that's entirely possible, and it's a different set of advice. So for those folks, what you need locations in different spots that show proof of concept. You have to be able to show that you can be successful in an urban setting, in a rural setting, in a suburban setting, preferably in a couple of different cities. Those are the things that really show proof of concept, that it's not about you as the owner, it's about the brand and what you're offering. And so for those folks, you have to be the entrepreneur. You can't be the man, and this is true for everybody. You can't wear all the hats. You can't be the owner, the manager, the trainer, the housekeeper, the plumber, like all the things that we all know as entrepreneurs we wear. You really have to extract yourself from the day to day and show that the business doesn't revolve around you. For the more owner operator types who aren't looking to scale to super ambitious heights. They just love their business. They love their community. They want to see it continue. The things that I think are the most important to make sure that you're setting up. Number one, I mentioned it already. Show the profit on your tax returns. That's absolutely critical. Make sure that your books are clean. No one, nothing kills deals harder than getting into due diligence and finding out there was a mistake in the bookkeeping. It's devastating when it happens. Dumb example, I had an owner put $50,000 of cash into his business because it was short, and the bookkeeper booked it as revenue. We didn't know, owner didn't know. We take it to market, say it's profitable. Turns out it's not. Deal falls apart. Everybody's devastated. And it's those things happen. And so you really have to make sure that your books are super clean. And then the last thing I would say is, in terms of red flags, leases can be a huge issue when you go to sell a business like this. And so how much time you have left on your lease, what sort of runway is there? Do you have enough time to negotiate with the landlord? If you're waiting until the last minute to try and sell because your lease is running out, you're shooting yourself in the foot again. Because landlords are the only third party in these deals that have their own interest, their own power and authority, and they can ruin deals on their own. And so, buyers usually need to see at least 3, probably 5 years on a lease to feel comfortable stepping into it. If they're getting an SBA loan, the bank is going to require that they've got at least 10 years of options. And so having a safe space in your lease is really important too. And so it's great to know the specific clauses of your lease in terms of assignment. Are you going to get a release of liability? Are you going to have to remain a guarantor through the whole duration of the lease? That's the worst. Like, most leases are written that way, where even after you assign it and you've sold the business, you're still liable for the lease. And nobody wants that. And so if you can negotiate your way out of that prior to doing the sale, you're going to be in a much better spot, kicking it on the beach in a hammock.
That's wild. I didn't think about the outside parties that can affect this, other than just the buyer and the seller. You mentioned about like making sure the numbers look right. When you're making sure the numbers are right, like, show profitability, does that mean, because I know that when you're looking at a sale or when somebody's looking to acquire a business, you can also just judge it based off of the SDE, right? I'm assuming, are we saying here, like, maybe they actually said, like, I made $100,000 in profit. Can they show, but they're showing they made $1,000. They didn't really make anything. Are we able to show the value here of saying, like, okay, well, we have, basically $100,000 in add backs, and does that now allow, I think for the buyer that can work, but that doesn't work for the bank. Am I understanding that correctly?
It depends. So it's a really smart point. And so we use SDE, seller's discretionary earnings, which is essentially the net income plus anything that's not necessary to the operation of the business. And so most common things we're talking about here are car payments, meals, travel, continuing education, all the stuff that we all use as owners in this space to write off because we can, and that's part of it. The bank will take some of them, and it always kind of depends a little bit. Every bank is different. But the more that you're explaining and fighting for these things, the more people start to black out. And so whether it's the buyer or the lender, if you're really trying to make the case for, $5,000 worth of supplies that you bought that were really for your house at home, they're not going to add that back. They're not going to believe you. If it's travel where you're like, yeah, look, my family went to Thailand for a week and we called it R&D for a workshop or retreat, that's a little more understandable and could be added back. Car payments are usually pretty easy to add back. The guaranteed ones obviously are all the EBITDA acronyms. So interest, taxes, depreciation, all of those are always add backs. So that's usually. Let me talk about salary actually real quick, because that's another, the salary becomes a really confusing one too. So most businesses in this industry are set up as S corporations where you're supposed to pay yourself a nominal salary so that the rest of the income is just a capital gains tax. You're not paying employment taxes on it. Usually banks will allow one owner's salary to be added back. So whether you're paying yourself through payroll with salary or not paying yourself through payroll at all, it ends up at the same number. So that is often confused. What I would say is more important is if you're paying yourself a salary because you're the manager and the lead trainer at your gym, no one's going to add it back because you're filling an operational role that has to be filled no matter what. And so if the buyer's going to buy into the business and you're going to leave, they're either buying themselves a job, which nobody ever wants to do, or they're going to have to pay someone else to do your job. And that's going to have a significant effect on the bottom line. And so that's the more important part of adding back salary to me is we can add it back if you're just an owner. But if you're filling an operational role, then it's a lot more difficult to justify that add back.
Makes sense. I think the last area that I want to go to here is, we've seen, like I said, we've seen a lot of gyms get sold, ownership transfers and things like that. And we've also seen a few of them fall through, even to the point that there was almost a new owner and we already knew the new owner and the deal did not completely go through. As somebody that, to a gym owner that's potentially looking to sell their business, I guess the question is, how should somebody manage their own expectations and their emotions of the whole selling process?
That just made me sigh. I don't know if you could feel that. The emotions in the process. Honestly, I say this to people and I'm really not joking. Like 90% of what I do is like being a therapist because these situations are so emotionally charged for everyone involved. For a seller who created a business and it's a baby, it's their baby. They birthed it, they grew it, and they love it. And to have someone else come in and take it over is a very strange and always on some level upsetting. It's just no one's ever going to be good enough. But the process takes forever. It usually takes, I say 8 to 9 months to make something like this happen. And usually what happens is about halfway through that, you make an agreement on the offer. So it's a couple months of marketing it, a couple months of negotiating, then you actually come to an agreement. Then the scary part begins because that's when due diligence starts. And that's when you go to the landlord. That's when you're working with the lender. And so all these other people start asking really pointed questions. And until you get paid, the deal is not done. And so it builds and it builds and it builds for months. And it is exhausting. And so there's a really staggering statistic that I always want to share. Forbes had this recently. Only 20% of businesses that get listed for sale actually sell. 20%. That is a terrible, terrible percentage. And the number one reason is because of how emotional of a process it is, unrealistic expectations of the seller. And if you're working with a broker, someone who knows this industry, knows what they're doing, they're going to manage those two things. They're going to make sure that the seller's expectations are in the right place. They're going to manage the emotional parts of it so that, truthfully, I've been a buyer and a seller. I know what each party feels like. Sellers are defensive and standoffish. Buyers are paranoid. That is a terrible juxtaposition. And those two people are not the right people to support each other emotionally because it just doesn't jive. And so I take everything, I let everybody vent, I hear them, I make sure they feel heard, and then I communicate what needs to be communicated as positively as I can to keep the deal going in a positive direction. And so it's hard. It's really, really hard. This job is taking years off of my life. There's no question about it. I used to have a full head of hair, but when it's done right, it really is a win-win, and everyone involved can move forward in a really positive, happy, productive way. And so that's why I love doing this.
All right. One more question here. And this is going to kind of sell you a little bit, but how important is it, in your opinion, or maybe try to be objective with this, for someone, if they are looking to sell, to use a broker that is industry specific versus being broad?
Truthfully, I get this question a lot, and it's a no-brainer for me. Um, I don't need to be in your town at all for any reason. What buyers need help with is knowing what's normal, what's fair. You know, I'll harp on Pilates one more time, just because it's most of what I'm doing right now. Um, Having a broker that understands the difference between classical Pilates, contemporary Pilates, and Legree is critical to finding the right buyer. Like someone who's really into Legree is probably not going to be into classical Pilates at all. And an industry agnostic broker who's just local isn't going to know any of the details of how to sell the difference of, you know, how do you assign a teacher training? Does that work? What's the equipment? Being able to speak intelligently about the industry, and then with buyers too, I'll come back to this again. So much of what I do is holding the buyer's hand and making sure that they're comfortable. So much of that is referring other people in the industry who I know. It's getting them liability insurance at the right price. I know the right insurance companies to reach out to for that. Getting the right attorneys involved so that they feel supported, CPAs, consultants, people like yourself. It's very, very, it's like the most common one, I would say. There's a lot of businesses with retiring age folks who don't do a lot of marketing. And there's a lot of opportunity for some of these businesses that are coming on the market for someone to step in and add these marketing systems to really boost the value of the company. And so those introductions, like me being able to introduce you to someone to help them as a buyer, is what makes the difference in that buyer feeling confident closing the deal.
That actually makes perfect sense, because we've also there's been a few instances where I've spoken to one of the prospective buyers of a client's business, and it's helped them feel the confidence that they need to feel about making the move forward. This has been awesome, Mitch. I think it's been very, very valuable, especially hearing about the emotional part of it. Because I can imagine it's like someone can get their hopes up, they sign an LOI, and then they go through hell, and it doesn't quite go the way as they've planned. Now it makes sense why 20%, only 20%, 1 in 5 are actually making it through the finish line here. Mitch, it's been great.
Yeah.
If anybody has any questions, or maybe they're looking to buy, maybe they're looking to sell, what advice would you have for them, and how can they get a hold of you?
It's my best advice is let's talk about it. I love talking about this stuff. There's never any pressure or obligation. And so if you want to reach out, you can schedule a consult just from my homepage. It's boutiquefitnessbroker.com. My email address is mitch@boutiquefitnessbroker.com. All my handles are at Boutique Fitness Broker. You should be able to find me there and schedule time, and let's just talk about it, because what I've found is that having this stuff brewing in the back of your mind years in advance really does manifest the exit that you're dreaming of. And with a little bit of time, I can really help make that a reality, where when you are finally ready to sell, it's just a matter of executing the plan and everything's dialed and ready to go.
So it sounds like if you're even mildly contemplating it, they should at least have a conversation with you.
Everyone should be thinking about this. There's some quotes. I think the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, with the book from Stephen Covey from a long time ago. I think number 2 is begin with the end in mind. No one should not be thinking about this. Oh, and looks like my internet just went weak.
I think we're back, Mitch.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I think that was my internet crapping out.
The last thing you were saying is that nobody should not be thinking about this, beginning with the end in mind.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's I love that book. And if you haven't read the book, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, it's a great book. And Stephen Covey's brilliant. And number 2 is begin with the end in mind. And, it doesn't need to be something you focus on consistently. It's just something that's brewing in the back of your mind. We're all going to have to exit our businesses one day. Whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. And most of us get into this industry not to get rich, but because we love the people and we love helping people live happier, healthier lives. And you deserve to get paid when you exit your business. And with a little bit of planning, you can have a much, much smoother, successful exit.
Awesome. All right, Mitch, this has been great. I really enjoyed the knowledge that you've dropped here for everybody. And if you want to get a hold of Mitch, boutique fitness broker, pretty much everywhere, .com and on social media. Thank you so much for your time, Mitch.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.